Today we are going to create a data table with the help of React, and this table is just vanilla HTML. There is no npm packages or third-party libraries used in creating the table. Now the table is going to have full CRUD functionalities. That is, you'll be able to create, read, and update data, and also delete data on the table. You can also perform a search filter operation. That is, you can search for data on the table and it will filter through the list we have here. So quickly, let me show you a sample of what we are going to build. And before I do that, let me let you know that the data on this table is coming from a third-party service called JSON Place Holder, and you can see on their platform that they are a service that provide free fake REST APIs for people to test and make modifications on projects, as close to a real world example as much as possible. And they have different endpoints. You have the / post, comments, photos, to dos, and the likes. But for the purpose of this tutorial, we're making use of the first one, which is / post. When I click on that, you will see that we have a list of 100 data on the page. So that's what you saw on the tab earlier in the page. The data here is up to 100. So going back to the tab here, let me show you what we have in store for this tutorial. So firstly, you can see that we have a add data button here. When I click on this, I'm provided with a title input field and as well as a body input field. So for the sake of a sample, let me just type in test title, and for the body I'll say test the body. Then if I click on the submit button, it's going to create a new post. When you scroll down to the bottom of the page, you can see that the newly created post has been added with its own unique ID. Now let's check out the next thing we have on this page is the action row. In this action row, if I click on the edit button for this very first ID, I'm provided with a modal pop-up. In this modal, I have two buttons: to save the row, that is when I make changes here in the input fields, and then to delete the rows. Let's first test out deleting the rows. If I delete this row, you see we are left with none of that data anymore. This is one with the second ID of 2. If I try to delete that also, it is gone. You see. Now the third ID, let's try to edit this. So I'm going to clear this title off and just say test 3 title, and then in the body I'll clear that off and just say test 3 body, and then I click on save row, and you can see the data is being updated in the table. And finally, we have a search data functionality. So if I try to search for something, let's search for tests. You see it's filtered through the rows that has tests, and also we can search for something else. Let's see this word dolorem. Let me copy this and paste this in the input field. So it filters through and displays only data with dolorem in the table. So that's what we're going to be building today. The link to this project is going to be in the description below. And before we get started, let me remind you to not forget to click on the like and the subscribe button. Also click on the notification bell to know when I create a new tutorial, as this is the best way to support the channel and for me to create new tutorials that can help you be a better developer. Thank you very much as you do that. So without wasting further time, let's get started. As you can see here, I have my Visual Studio Code editor open. I created this using Create React app, and I believe you know how to do the same. I don't want to edit too much of the template, so I'll just clear out the app components we have here, which is created by default using Create React app. So I clear off the header as well as the class name called app. Next up, I try to integrate the design for the table. For the sake of this project, we'll be making use of Bootstrap 5. So I head straight up to the browser, create a new tab, and then search for Bootstrap 5. what we need from the Bootstrap 5 is the CDN, which we will be putting in the public directory. First off, I copy the CSS of the Bootstrap 5, go to the public directory, open the index.html, and in the head section, you can put it anywhere as long as it's within the head section. So I'm going to put it close to the title here, and then we would also need the script tag. So we click copy and then head back to the index.html, and in the body of the index.html we include the script tag. Then we press save. Once that is saved, that's all we need to do in the index.html. Now we need to create two different files. The first file we are going to create is going to be called the table.js. Next one is the readtable.js. For now, we are going to start working with the table.js. So I'm going to generate a snippet using a functional component. We need to create a table tag. So I create a table tag, and inside this table tag, we have a table head. And in the table head, we have a table row. The table row has a th tag also. Now each row has an attribute called scope, which is called call. So the first head is going to be called user ID, as we saw in the example I showed previously. I'm going to duplicate this 4 more times. So the next one is going to be called the ID. The next one is going to be called the title. Body, as well as action. Next up, we have below the t head tag, we have the table body. So we have a t body tag. So inside the t body tag, we will have where the data of our table will be contained. So before we do anything, it will be a tr tag as well as a td tag. In the table data, the user ID, we can just have one, that is this first scope here represents this first table data here. Let me duplicate this 4 more times. So the next thing we need to have here is the ID. Then we have the title. For the title, let me head back to JSON Placeholder and just copy the title we have here in this very first data, paste it in here, and then we also have the body. So I go back to JSON Placeholder, copy the body text, paste, and the action, we have what we call edit, which is going to be a button, but for now let's leave it as edit, like a text. Before I proceed, the table is going to have a class name which is coming from Bootstrap. Bootstrap comes with some custom class names, and the first class name we are going to have, which is going to make our table responsive and then easy to work with. The first one is table. Then we have table bordered. Then we have border primary, which will make the borders to be blue. Then the table responsive class. This will make our table responsive for mobile viewers. So I think that is all for the table. Next thing we need to do is to import this table in our app.js. So I'm going to copy this and then add into the app.js, bring it in as a component, then import it in the app.js. Now that the table is imported in the app.js, let's check the browser, and there you have our data. Perfect. Now I don't like how this is looking like. I need to add some margins. So in the app, in the index.css file, I'm going to make some changes. Let me add 10 to the margin so we have some space around the table and everything doesn't look too complex. Now this makes it easy for us to see all the borders around the table. So the next step is to call the endpoints from JSON Placeholder. Now we currently have static data, and that is not what we want. We want the data from the JSON Placeholder documentation. So to do that, we are going to install Axios. I need to stop the server and then make use of yarn. So I'm going to type yarn add Axios. Now that Axios is fully installed, then we can restart the server by running npm start. Let's close this and then head back to the table components. So inside the components, we need to make use of two hooks in React. The first one is called the useState hook, while the second one is called the useEffects hook. Now, the first we will be using is the useState. First, we are going to create some variables, that is a getter and a setter. So the first variable inside this is going to be called posts, which is a getter, and the second one, which is set posts, is a setter. Now we are going to assign this to a useState hook in React, which is going to be an empty array because our data is coming in form of an array. This is supposed to be inside this const table. So I'm going to paste this here. Now we need to make use of the useEffects hook. Now to do this, I'm going to call useEffects, and we're going to assign to it an arrow function, and inside this arrow function we have an empty array which is called a dependency injection. Before we proceed further, I'm going to comment at the top of this useEffects, get data from JSON Place Holder, which is the source of our API. Then I'm going to head back to the browser, go to the JSON Placeholder documentation, and then on the home page you can see we have a /post here which contains 100 posts. I'm going to click on that, and then I'm going to copy the URL. So to paste the URL, it's going to be assigned to a variable called fetch URL, and then we paste it inside a quote. Now this useEffect, the way we are going to call the API is going to be in an asynchronous manner. So we're going to make use of ES6 syntax called async await. Now I start off by typing the async keyword and then creating a function called fetch data. So inside this fetch data is going to be a function that takes in a variable called data. So we are going to await the response of the data by typing await, by making use of the await keyword and typing axios.get. and then inside the Axios just that we're going to pass in the fetch URL, which contains the data of that we want to put on our table. So the next thing I want to do is to console.log this data to be sure if we have the data available. Now there's one more thing we need to do before we proceed. We haven't import Axios, so I'm going to import Axios from Axios. Then before we check the result of our data in the browser, I need to call this fetch data URL for our function to render. So fetch data, and then I save. Head straight to the browser, ensure the page is fully refreshed, open the console, and then check if you have the data available. As you can see here, we have an object. Let me increase the size, and then inside this object we have the data. So we have different keys. We have the config keys, which contains the URL of containing our data, and then the data itself. So when I open the data, you can see we have a list of 100 posts, which is fantastic. That means we can render this on the page. And also we got a status response of 200, which means it's a successful request. So we can see that we have a data key here. So to get this data, we need to have access to it in our Visual Studio Code. So I close the console, head straight back in here. Then what we need is only data. So we need to now make use of the setter inside our use state hook. So I'm going to copy that and then paste it in here, and then it will take in the data we want to use. So that will be data dot data. That is the data that contains all the arrays of objects we want to display on the page. So once that is done, we can now have access to the data in this getter called posts. If I console log the data, like the posts variable, so if I say console.log posts and I save and I head straight to the browser, yes, you can see we have a list of all the data in the posts. Now this data is what we use to loop through the table, but there's something I want you to note. We have the data rendering so many times. This is not something we want, so with the help of the dependency injection we can stop this. So what I'm going to do is to copy this URL and then paste it here, so that our data can only render once when we call it. So let me save and refresh the page so you see what I mean. You see, we only have the data rendering once. So this is perfect because of performance issues, and to avoid the data re-rendering on so many occasions, we make use of the dependency injection to stop that from occurring. So next up is to display the data on the table. Now to display the data on the table, what we have in React is called JSX, which allows us to perform some JavaScript operations in our HTML. So inside our table, above our table row, we are going to open a bracket and then loop through the posts array data. So what we have is post.map, and then we're gonna have a variable called posts. So inside of each post, I'm gonna cover that here. So inside of this post, we are going to have access to each key in the posts array. So the first one is going to be the user ID. So what I'm going to do here is to open another set of brackets. So I'm going to say posts dot user ID, Then the next one is going to be inside a bracket also, post dot id. Then the next one we have is the title. Let me clear this up. So we have post dot title as well as post dot body. With this, we should have our data displayed inside of the table. So let me save and then head back to the browser. As you can see, we now have all our data, 100 data displayed on the table perfectly. This is looking good. So let's check the console if we have any form of error. It says each child in a list should have a unique key prop. So this is React trying to track each of the data. So what we can do here is to assign a key attribute. So inside this key attributes, we can pass in a unique ID. That is our IDs, a data that is kind of unique for each post. So when I pass in post.id and then we refresh the page, that error should be gone. So it's gone. Everything is looking perfect. We can move to the next step, which is to design the modal pop-up as well as the add data button. So let's start with that. Now to add the modal, I'm going to copy the button that triggers the modal from my notepad there. I don't want to waste much time designing this. So this button is going to be directly above the table tag. So let's format this properly. Now what we have here is a import type of button, and then we have a class name which includes some margins and then other classes that makes the button looks good. And the most important thing we need to take note of here is the attributes here. The first attribute here is called the database toggle, which indicates that it's a modal, and the second one is data targets, which has something like an hashtag, which is like an ID of add modal form. What means is that it's going to trigger any part of the UI that has an ID that is also called add modal form. So to see that in action, let me copy the design of the modal and then paste it just below the table tag. So I can just call this add modal design. Now, like I said earlier, the div containing the entire content of the modal has an ID called add modal form, which we have in the button here. So that means in the UI, when we click on this add data button, it's going to trigger this add modal form. So what I did was inside the modal, I have a form that contains some input fields. So the first one is called the user ID. It's disabled, that is we can't edit it. The second one is called the title and is an input type of text. Then the third one is a body, which also has a text area and then a row and a column that contains where we can type in the data we want to input or add data. And then we have a submit button with a type of submit. Now, one thing you should also note in the submit is we have a data dash ps dash dismiss attributes. That is, this will dismiss the modal once we click on this submit button. So if you are wondering how I have access to all this data, you can head back to the Bootstrap 5 documentation, and if you search for modal, you will see how examples of different modal components in the documentation. So you can integrate the ones you want the way you want it. So what I just did was to add some forms to each of the modals. So different designs are available here. So make sure to check out the documentation if there's anything you do not understand. Now, with that being said and done, let me save this and let's see how the page looks in the browser. As you can see, we have a add data button just like we have in the sample at the beginning of the video. So if I click this add data button, it is going to trigger the modal, and then we have an add new post modal. which is fantastic. So we can enter a title, and then the text area we can enter a body. So when I click on this submit, nothing's going to happen. It will just dismiss the modal because we have not configured this to receive some default functions that will perform the operation we want. So it just clears the modal and refreshes the page. That's something would prevent with the use of the prevent default method in JavaScript. So the next thing we need to do is to create the edit pop-up modal. So to do that, we head back to Visual Studio Code. So inside Visual Studio Code, similar to what we did in the add data button, I'm going to copy this, and then I'm going to paste this and inside the edit text here to replace the text. So the button would now be edit instead of add data. So edit, then I save and head back to the browser. As you can see, we now have our edit button inside the action. If I should click on this, it's still going to trigger the add data modal because I have not created the design for the edit modal. So that's not what we want. We want its own separate modal. So to do that, I'm going to change the ID of add modal form to add edit modal form. Okay. Next up, let's copy the add modal design, which is going to be similar to the edit modal design. Copy that, create some space, paste that in, and then in the comments, I can just say edit modal design. So the ID we have in the edit button, we can copy that, and then inside the edit modal design, we can replace the add modal form with that. So that's going to trigger this particular form. Now the next thing we need to do is to edit the modal content. So quickly, the heading is going to be edit row. So I remove this add new post and change it to edit row. And then next up, we need to change. Okay, we don't need to change much. We just need to add an extra button because we are going to have two buttons at the end. The first one is going to be save row, and the second one is going to be delete row. So for the saved row, I'm going to have save row, and then let's duplicate this button. So that will be delete row. Now, when you look at the class here, the class name here is float end. So for the button not to be together, we're going to change this particular delete row to float start, so that it is going to be at the left hand side of the modal. So let me save and let's test this out in the browser. I click on the edit button. Okay, I think it has not updated. Let me refresh. I click on the edit button, and then we have save row and delete row. I don't like these colors. I want the color to be green and red. So I can just type in here btn. I can change this btn1 into btn success, and then this will be btn danger. So let's save that, head back to the browser, and then our changes is reflected. So we have the edit row modal, and then we have the add new post modal. Now the next thing I want to do is to make these modals functional. That is, we want to add new posts and as well as have functionality to delete and also save new posts. So quickly, let's head back to VS Code. So the first functionality we're going to create is the add post. To do that, we head to the top of the file and we create a new set of variables, setters and getters, using the use state hook in React. So we create what we call add post, as well as what we call set equals to use state. Now we would want the data to be exactly like what we have in the form. So we open a bracket, and inside the bracket we have an object that would contain the form values. The first one is the user ID, which is going to be disabled, and because it's going to be by default, we're going to assign it a value of 10. And then we have the title, which will be editable, so that will be an empty string. And the second one is the body, which is also going to be an empty string. Now what we need to do next is to create the functionality to get the values of this form data. To do that, we're gonna create a comment to make people understand what we are doing here. So get form values, and what we want to do is to log it to the console. So I create a new variable called const undo change. So in the undo change, we are going to have two brackets here. The first one is going to be an input, which represents the input field, and it's going to have an arrow function, and then another bracket that takes in an event, synthetic event, and then we open the curly brace brackets. And then the first thing we need to do is to make reference to the event by typing e dot prevent default. What this does basically is to prevent the default behavior of every form on the page from reloading. Now, next up, we make reference to the setter, which is set at post, which we have right here. So what I'm going to do is to say set at post, and then I open a bracket, and then as well as an object, and then spread the values of the at post here, and make reference to the input, which is the input field we are going to be entering data in, and then we assign it the event dot target dot value. So to be sure we are doing the right things, what I'm going to do is to console.log the getter, which is the add post. So what I will do here is console.log add post. For us to be able to do this, we are going to make use of an on change event handler. So I'm going to copy this particular variable, head straight to the modal where we have the add modal design, and then in each of the input fields we will have the variable called undo change. So for the first one, which is the user ID, we are going to have down below here an on change event handler, which is going to be equals to the particular variable we created above, which is undo change, and we're going to assign to it the parameter called user ID. So this enables the attribute to know we are dealing with the user ID here. So for the title, we do the same, passing the undo change and the unchange event handler. So this will be title, and finally below that we are going to have the body. So anytime I type, the values will be logged to the console. Let's save and test that out. In the browser, I'm going to open the console, and then I'm going to open the modal. Now to test this out, I'm going to make use, instead of using the console directly, let's make use of the components in the React Dev Tools. If you don't have that installed, you can search for React Dev Tools in the browser for Chrome and also for Mozilla. I think it's available. Once you install it, you have access to this. So when you click on the component, then you click on the table. So inside the table, you can see we have some hooks here, and then we have a state hook that contains the body, the title, and the user ID, which we have in the states in our VS Code. Then we try to modify the state by opening the modal, typing some values in the title. Let me type in A. As you can see, the values we type in is being displayed in the title and also in the body. So we have the values, which shows that the values of our form is being assigned to our state, which is awesome. So inside VS Code, we create the variable that adds the data to the table. So to do that, below the undo change, we can just create a comment that says add data to table. This is going to be in the form attributes. So we create a variable called const handle add posts. So inside this variable, we have an arrow function, and inside this arrow function, we pass in our values. So the very first thing we do is to prevent the default behavior of the form. So e.prevent default, and then we create a new variable object. So we say const new post is equals to, then we have an ID, because for each new post we create, it has to have a unique ID. So for this to work, we need to install an npm package that generates a new ID for each post we create. I'm going to leave it like this for now. Let me just enter a custom ID of 101, and then the next one is going to be user ID. So the user ID is coming from the outpost variable we created. So outpost dot user ID. Then the next one is the title. So title add posts dot title, and then the last one is the body. So the body, you say add post dot body. So next thing we need to do is to create another variable called new posts. New posts. So inside this new post, we spread posts data coming from the API into this, as well as the new post we created in this object we created over here. So we now set the new post to the API. So to do that, we call this setter, which is set posts, and then we pass in our new variable, which is called new posts. Copy that, paste that right in, and then we now head over to our form. So the attribute that handles this in the modal is called, okay, we have a form here, so it's going to be the onSubmit event attribute, onSubmit. So we pass in the handle post variable. So quickly, let's save and then head straight to the browser to test this out. Let me refresh the page. Now I click on add post. Let's just say test 3 or test 101, then body 101. So I click on submit and then head straight to the bottom of the page. As you can see, we have a new post added to the API, and the result we have here also contains the new data we just created. Now quickly, I don't want to manually input the ID, so let me just install the npm package that adds the new ID to the new posts dynamically. To do that, I get straight to the terminal, stop the terminal, and then I type in npm install react dash id dash generator. So while that is installing, I can just head straight to their documentation And on the page, you can see that what we need to do is to import the next ID from React ID generator and pass in the next ID that will generate new data dynamically. So let's wait for that to install and try it out. Now that the React ID generator has been installed, let's restart the server. So npm start and then head back. Let's copy this, import next ID from React ID, head straight to the browser, paste this at the top of our page, and then copy this next ID object and then replace it with the static ID we have here and then save. Let's create new data. Click on the add data button, type in some random strings or words on the keyboard, then press submit. Scroll down to the bottom of the page. As you can see, we have a new ID, which is ID 1. If I create another data, it will generate another ID called ID 2. Let's just add to this and submit. See, we have another set of data called ID 2. So our add functionality works perfectly well. The next thing we need to do is to create the save, that is update, and then the delete functionality. Now to create the edit post, first thing I want to do is to create some separation of concern. What do I mean by this? I would like to have our posts loop in the read table component. So I'm going to cut everything inside the t body tag out, head to the read table, generate a snippet for a functional component, then create a fragment and then paste that in. Now I'm going to get the data from the post as props. So I'm going to have posts here, and then inside of the t body I'm going to import the read table component. So copy React table, paste that in here, and then import the read table components in the table components, and then assign the props to it, which is called post. So we have posts equals to posts. So let me save that and see if our app is still running the way we have it before without any form of error. And yes, it does work. Now we can quickly work on the update and delete functionality. So just like we did in the add posts, we are going to create new setters and getters. So the first one we are going to create is the want to get the ID. So this will be get ID, because for us to update the post, we need to know the specific post we want to update, and to do that we need to get the ID. So we're gonna have const edit post ID as well as set edit post ID equals to use state, and the default value will be null. Then the next thing we need to create in the use state is the form data, because we need to get the form values, and to get the values and data we need to have a getter which is called edit form data, and then set edit form data, and we assign it to the use state hook. And just like we did previously, we need it to take the formats in which our form comes in. So I'm just going to copy this user ID, title, and body, paste it in here, and then we are good to go. Next up, we need to create some variables. The first variable we need to create to enable us edit the data is to handle the get the values as the form changes. So I'm going to create a comment here saying edit data value. we have a variable called handle edit change, and just like we did previously, it's going to have an input arrow function as well as an event arrow function. Before we now open the brackets, then the first thing we need to do is to prevent defaults as usual. Prevent defaults. Then quickly we set the edit form data, and then we spread the getter, which is edit form data, and then because it's going to be in an input, we assign it to an input, and then we assign it the event.target.value to get the values of the form as we type. Now we need to pass this handle edit change to our modal, so we head straight to the edit modal, and then the first thing we do is to assign the attributes. The first attribute is going to be on change, so this is not going to be handle change, this is going to be handle edit change, and this is going to be user ID, just like we have in the add modal. So the next one is going to be body, the title rather, so this is going to be title, and finally we have the body. Now before I test it out, I want to also create the handler for the form itself, so I go up and then I create a new variable. So this is to edit the data in the modal. Edit modal data. So we create a variable const handle edit post form. Okay, it's gonna take in two variables. The first one is the event parameter as well as the post parameter. So we open an arrow function. So inside the arrow function, as usual, the first thing we need to do is to prevent the default behavior of the form, which is to reload, and then we now set the setter for the edit post ID. So that takes in the posts dot the particular post ID we want to edit, and then next thing we need to do is to create new values for the form the way it is we created it in the modal. So we create it in an object way, so form values is equals to inside an object, just like we did in the add modal and add handle post rather. So this is just going to take in the user ID, the title, and the body. Let me copy this and modify it. So quickly, instead of add post, this will be posts, just like we created here. So I change the add post to post. So post.user ID, post.title, and post.body. Then finally we set the new values for the edit form data, and then passing the form values. So once this variable is created, what we can do next is to pass it as props to our read table component. So what I'm going to do is to create the props here, and then get the value in our read table components. This will enable us to access the ID when we click on the edit modal, because without the ID we can't really do anything. So this is going to be an on click event handler. So on click, I'm going to open a bracket, and then it's going to be an arrow function. So inside this arrow function we pass in the prop, which is gotten from the table component, and then we pass in the two parameters, which is the events and then the posts. With that, we are done with getting the ID from the table components. Now The last thing we need to do to have a functional edit modal is to create one more variable to save the data. So we can just have a comment that says save from data, save or update. You can use anyone, it's fine. So we can just say const form undo form save. It's much better. Undo form save. Undo form save is equals to event and then an arrow function, as we usually do. And then we have the event or prevent default event handler. And then we create, the first thing we do is create an object to save the post. So save post object. So inside this object, we need to have the values of what we want to save. So the first one is the ID. Now the ID has to tally with the post we intend to save, to ensure we are saving the right post. So we created a variable called edit post ID. So let me copy that. That's what we'll make reference to and pass to the ID when we want to save the form. And then the next one is the user ID, and then we call the edit form data dot user ID. Then the last two is the title and the body Now we need to create a new variable called new posts or edited posts. Anyone is fine. And then we spread it to the value of the posts as the new post that we want to update using the spread operator. Then we create a new variable called the index of the form to ensure that we are saving it's equal to the right post ID. So to do that, we call posts dot find index, which is a JavaScript function that helps us to find an index of a post or of an array. So posts, using an arrow function, we can say if the post dot id is equals to edit post id. Now we call our new post and then assign to it this form index. Then we call our save post equals to save post. So that means the value of our save post is now inside this new post. Now for us to now set the values, once the button is clicked, we need to call the setters, the two setters we created earlier. The first one is the set post. So set post is going to take in the new post that we just edited. So that will be new post. And then set edit post ID is also going to take in a value of null. All right, so I think that's all we need to do to update the post. We need to test this out. So I'm going to copy this variable, head straight to the edit post modal, and inside the form we'll make use of the onSubmit event handler, and then we pass it in. So let's save and head back to the browser to ensure we don't have any form of error. Okay, cool. So I click on edit action. Okay, before I test this out, I noticed there's something we didn't do. We didn't get the values of the particular title and body and the user ID. That's something I want us to do. So we ensure that we are getting the value of the post we want to edit. So to do that, we need to have a value attribute. So value is equals to, so inside the value attribute, we're going to make reference to the edit form data. So the first one is going to be edit form data dot user ID. Same will apply to the title and the body. So let me copy this. So this will be dot title and this will be dot body. Hopefully this works. So let's save and head back to the browser once again. So let's click on the first ID. Whoa, it works at first try, which is awesome. So there are no errors in the browser. Okay, now let's try to update. So I'm going to clear everything here. So I'm going to say test 1 title, and then in the body clear that out, say test 1 body. So let's save that particular row, and we are able to save the row. We are able to update the row. Let's update for, let's say, number 10, the 10th ID. See, it's able to get that data, which is awesome. And test 10, and inside the body we can see test 10, and let's save that row. So for the 10th, you see we're able to edit that. So the update functionality is working perfectly well. So finally the last one we need to work on is the delete functionality. To delete the data is pretty much straightforward. It's not different from what we've done earlier. So quickly, we need to create a variable, functional variable that does that. So just below the, or just above the use effect hook, we can just create a comment that says delete data. So const handle delete is equals to an arrow function that has an event handler or parameter. So e dot prevent defaults, just like we've done on so many occasions in this tutorial. And then first thing we need to do is to create a new variable called new posts, and then assign it to the post in our data or in the use effect we created earlier. So now that we have access to that, we can now create another variable to get the index of the particular row we want to delete. So I can just say posts dots using the find index, just like we did when we wanted to update. So find index of the particular post we want to delete, and then we ensure that the post's ID is equals to the edit post ID. Once that is confirmed, then we make use of we call the new post, but this time around we splice it. Splice is a JavaScript method that removes or adds to a particular array, but this time we are removing it from the form index, and what we are removing is just one data. So we pass in another argument, which is 1. So we now call the set post to set the result of the new post, and then pass in the new post. I think that's all. Quickly, let's copy this particular variable, head straight to the bottom of the edit modal where we have the delete button. It's going to be an on click event handler. So I can just say on click and then pass in the delete handler. Save, refresh the page. Okay, we've got an error of post is not defined. Okay, supposed to be posts, not posts. So I correct that. I save, refresh the page once more. All right, Let's delete the first ID and see if it works. Click on edit and delete row, and you see our delete functionality works. We are able to delete the particular ID of the page. So our CRUD functionality is working well. We're able to read the data, we're able to add new data, we're able to edit and update the data as well as delete data. So you might remember I said we have a search input which we want to implement. So quickly let's do that, and then we'll call this tutorial a day. So for the search filter, I'm going to quickly copy a a set of tags which is a form, and then I'm going to paste it within the button div we have here. So it's just a basic form with an input field, and then I save that. There's nothing special here you need to know. It contains some set of Bootstrap 5 default classes. So let's check how it looks like on the page. So as you can see, it has a placeholder of search data. So for now it does nothing, but when we implement it as we type on key up, it's going to filter through the data. So quickly we need to create a function that does that. So over here we can just have search filter data, a comment that says search filter data. So inside these comments we have a variable. You can just say const search query. We're making use of the use state hook. So set search query and the use state hook. Okay, the use state hook by default is going to be an empty string. I think this should also be at the top of the page. Not to be, shouldn't be here. Let me call that and put it at the top of the page. So what we are doing is kind of consistent. So let me put it here, and then head back to where we want to implement our search filter. So once we have that, so we're going to have a function called search. So the search function is going to take in an object, and then we're going to return posts, that is that post that contains all our data dot filter. This helps us, is JavaScript function that helps us filter through the posts, and then for each row we are going to filter using the row dot title, right? Then for it to work we need to convert it to lowercase, and then dot index of, and then we call the search query getter in the use state index we just created at the top of the page, and then if it's greater than 1, search query the data. So that's what we are doing here. Pretty much straightforward. So what we need to do to make this work is to head straight to our read table prop over here, and then paste the function and then pass the post inside of the function, so it would be able to query the data. I think with this should work at first try. I'm positive about this. So let's save and then refresh the page to ensure all the states are at the state where they need to be, and then let's search for qui. Nothing happens. Okay, yes, nothing happens because in the input field we haven't done anything. Oh boy. So in the input field, yes, my bad. So the first thing I want to do is to pass in an unchanged event handler as well as a value. So the value for this is going to be search query, and then the unchanged event handler which implements as the values of the form changes. Okay, what we have is an arrow function. How did I forget this? Wow, so important. So we need to call the setter, which is the set search query, and then it takes in the event.target.value. So event.target.value, and then we save that. Hopefully we see changes this time around. Once again, I search for, let me search for dolem, dolorem, dolorem, and you see everything that has dolorem is being displayed. So let me create a default data and then filter through it. Let's see. Let me create my name, the G title, the G body. So once I submit this and scroll to the bottom of the page, then let's check the edits. To edit, let me just go to JSON Placeholder, copy some random body and paste it there and save the row. Whoa, it's updated, as you can see, with a new ID of ID1. Then let me search for my name. So let me search for the G. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. We have a fully functional data table that can perform CRUD functionalities like creating, reading, updating, and deleting of data, and also a search query. So if you stay to this point, thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate you guys. If you have any questions, drop it in the comment section below. And if you love this video, please give it a like and subscribe. I really appreciate that. And that will help with the algorithm on YouTube to recommend my videos to other people that might learn from this tutorial. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.